Thank you. Well, it's very nice of you to allow me to share this lovely ambience. I love that. It's beautifully done. And I've been told to talk about houses of prayer. Every one of you lives somewhere, either in a house or a room or a shed, I presume. Did you have a roof last night? Yes. Then this is for you, what I am about to say. And Joppa, the first reading, was a house, and there was a healing. And then Jesus talks about the kingdom of God, the ultimate perfected way of human life being organised around God. And he says there's a place that's perfectly suited to everybody. There are many rooms. But it's rather nice, isn't it, to think that you can be, tailor-made. A place where you fit, where you flourish. Wonderful idea. So anyway, I've been writing about houses of prayer because the leader of the youth work of the church where I was minister came and stayed for a holiday because he couldn't afford a holiday anywhere else. So I let the family have my downstairs in my one-bedroom cottage. That wasn't part of the eventual plan, probably. But anyway, he said, I'm a bit fed up because our church has got to raise a lot of money for the church roof, and in my heart I feel that if we just had a house of prayer in every few streets, it would do much more good and be much less expensive. This has no relevance to this church whatever. And something clicked inside me, and I thought, well, I'm going to start reading the Bible and learning about houses of prayer. So I'm just going to tell you a few things. You know, the first reference in the Bible to a house of prayer wasn't a house at all. It was Jacob wrestling with God and sleeping outside on a stone pillow, and in a dream he saw a ladder come down from heaven to earth and angels going up and down. And it was such a holy encounter with God in that place that he marked it with a big high standing stone so that people would come. And he called it Beth El, House of God. And ever since then, innumerable, uncountable houses, halls, tin tabernacles all over the world have been called Beth El, the House of God. But when Moses came along, he told everybody, when you get up, make a prayer to God, like Muslims do. It's an oath of allegiance to God. And write it out and put it on your doorpost, and then tell all the kids to say it aloud and memorize it, so that your house is dedicated to God. And then, of course, they went into the Promised Land and got settled. And they had three great festivals, and two of the three great festivals were held in homes. You know what they were? Passover, the Festival of Booths, the Harvest Festival. Do you know what they did for that? They built little huts made of branches, but they had open at the top so they could be dependent on God. It was an experience of reminding themselves that they relied on God's providence. Now, we, in our welfare state, when we have to go through endless red tape and lists and bits of paper to get anything, we need to remember that ultimately we're depending on God's providence. And there are Jews in Salford and various other places who still put up tents for the Festival of Booths in the gardens, usually, to have a cup of tea in the afternoon and go back to the central heating to sleep, for all I know. But nevertheless, it's a symbol. And you could do that if you've got a house with a garden, any of you. You could put a tent up in a garden for a week in October and have a barbecue and invite people around, and it'd be a house of prayer. So there are things like that happening. And then, of course, there's the famous story of both the prophet Elijah and the prophet Elisha. And the prophet Elijah was around in a famine, and he prayed for a poor old widow woman who'd run out of oil and everything to cook with. And he prayed, and the oil was sufficient. And she was so grateful to this prophet that she made a room in her house for him to come and stay any time. It was set aside. It was the prophet's room in the house. Hey, wouldn't that be good if you got a spare bedroom, to have it as a place for somebody who wants to seek God could come and just stay? And I know people who've made a little attic or something like that into a place for prayer. It's a great idea. So that sort of thing went on, but we also know that they prayed on the housetops. Of course, it was Mediterranean and it's warm. So, but also it's a space where you can be on your own. And lots of people use the rooftops as their place of prayer. And in the Acts of the Apostles, it was when Peter was praying like that he had a vision from God that in future everybody would be welcome. In other words, they got the cottoned onto some bride's idea of being an inclusive church. Because before that, he'd thought half the people weren't welcome because they ate pig food or something like that, or whatever, and so they weren't clean. And now God said to call nothing unclean. And that all came out of praying on the roof of a house. It's wonderful. Well, the other thing is that when they all became Christians, they had the big temple in Jerusalem, of course, and they did go and pray there, but not many people lived near the temple, and anyway, the temple got knocked down. So what did they do? They met in houses. And the New Testament churches were house churches. Not quite what we think by a house, because a typical house, well, there were lots of different kinds of houses, but a typical house might have two little courtyards. So you'd have mum and dad and the kids in one little place. Then the other side you might have granny. On the other side you might have a visitor's place. And you might have a work quarter. So you might have 50 people in the extended household, and that was a church. And they've done archaeological excavations on the house that it's probably the mum of Peter's wife owned in Capernaum. And Jesus probably stayed in one of the rooms. He was a lodger there in Capernaum. And in the 4th century, they turned that room into a church or chapel. And of course everybody came to it to pray. And they've done some archaeological excavations. You can get it on the internet. House of Peter in Capernaum. Very interesting. And even when so they had two sorts of houses. One was the kind of terraced house which was small, where the poorer people had, and one was a kind of big villa where the posher people had, and that was called a domus, and from which we get our word the dome, in the big buildings, and domestic. And so both kinds of house were used for the original churches, the small house and the domus. And when the empress became Christian and something went a bit wrong with Christianity, it became a bit important and grand. And they built great big basilicas, unlike this church here, which is a big basilica, I suppose. It hasn't got a dome on there. Anyway, to begin with, if you look at Rome, they chose as their site the site of a house which had been a house of prayer. And then they put this big church over the top. So they still had the symbolic idea that the church was a home or house of prayer, even when they became big. But it did spoil it, the intimacy, when church became big. But that was in the Roman Empire in Rome. But if you go further out to what's now Turkey, Ephesus and all that sort of place, John went out there. Now, do you remember when Jesus was dying on the cross? He cared about his mum, as well as caring about the salvation of the whole human race and the whole cosmos, which makes me think I want to follow this man. What an amazing man. But he actually thought about his mum as well on the cross. And some people think that her sister was Salome, and Salome was the mother of John, so they were related. And anyway, he said, John, take her into your home, and Mum, look after him. And so John took Mary into his home. And they think he had her house in Jerusalem. But that didn't last long because there was a persecution. So he went over to Ephesus. And some people think that Mary died before that in Jerusalem. The Roman Catholics used to say, you know, they call it the Assumption of Mary into heaven. They used to say it went from Jerusalem. But something very interesting happened. A nun, a Catholic nun, had a very amazing series of visions about last century, I think it was, a century and a half ago. And she had the most detailed pictures of the house that Mary lived in Ephesus. Great detail. Well, people can have visions and you don't take them seriously, but somebody wrote all these down in a book. And then some Catholic missionaries came along and went over to the area, and to their amazement, they found a house that fitted in exact detail. And then they found, to their even greater amazement, that in little villages in the country areas, 20, 30 miles away, it had been a tradition for centuries that among the people in these villages, that Mary had lived there in that house. And people didn't know. So they've restored a house, and they've got a prayer wall in it. I haven't been, but has anybody here been to Mary's house at Ephesus? Yeah, did you see the prayer wall?
Yes,
yeah. And you're covered in prayers. It's a lovely idea. If you can, if you've got a garden, have a prayer wall. And anyway, Pope Benedict went there and agreed that Mary might have gone into heaven from there rather than in Jerusalem, and they changed what they give, indulgences or whatever, and which is irrelevant to houses of prayer. But I'm just making the point that that's a house of prayer in Ephesus. Well, you may think that's very nice for them in those hot countries, but what about us in these poor rain-soaked northern clime of the British Isles? Well, I have good news for you, because the house that John built, that idea of the church's houses of prayer, came to these islands too through an unexpected route. There was Martin of Tours, who was in the Roman army, and he got converted. Why? Because when he was a boy, he was in a storm and ran into a nearest house, and there was a church service going on, and in the church service there was some beautiful singing and readings from the Gospels which entranced him. But what entranced him most of all was that there was an area where people, we might say today, with learning difficulties, who were looked down upon in the Roman society. But in this church they were treated like God's special people, and with great love and dignity, and each one had a helper called an exorcist, just to complicate things, but it was a helper, a carer beside them. And Martin was so touched by the love as well as the words and the music that he said, I'm going to become a Christian. And he did. And he got out of the army eventually, and he went to see Bishop Hilary in France, who said, I want you to be ordained and come and help me. No, said Martin, I want to be just a simple person. So he said, all right, I've got a farm hut called the Bright White Hut down in Ligouge. Go and live in that and teach all the people around how to do ploughing and learn agriculture and how to pray and how to follow Jesus, and recruit people so that you can train them. Well, to cut a long story short, Martin's one little Bright White Hut grew and grew, and lots of other little white houses grew. And eventually the rent-a-crowd came. They needed a new bishop of Tours. This is an idea when you've got a new bishop, so you're all right. But when you need a new bishop, they said, we want someone like Martin who doesn't dress up posh like I have today, but I've only done it for Ruth's sake. Is just an ordinary scruffy man who heals people and loves people and trains people and lives in this little house. So we want someone like that as bishop. So they had to rent a crowd and kidnapped him. And they took him to Tours and they made him a bishop. But in those days they brought in thrones when people became bishops because they'd gone all imperial. And Martin said, take away a throne, bring me a cow stool. And he sat on the cow stool and they made him bishop. But he didn't like his bishop's palatial headquarters, so he toddled down the River Loire a few miles and to a little cave in the side of the cliff by the river. You can still go down there. And he lived in this little house cave, whatever you want to call it, a house of prayer. Oh, and other people began to come into the other little caves and live there. And then women said, "We won't leave us out." Well, so they had to go into the city where they would be protected. So all this thing spread. And then people from Britain, when the Roman troops left, and there was hardly any Christianity left, and it looked pretty lost cause, they went over to get ordained in Rome or something like that, and they would always stay at Martin's place in Tours, and they got really excited by these little white houses. And one of these people was Ninian, and he came back and he started a little white house on what a place is now called Whithorn. And lots of people from Wales went there. Any Welsh people here? Oh, bring them in. But somebody from Liverpool said, "I'm 98% Welsh because we get all our water from Wales." There you go. Anyway, all these little white houses spread through Wales as well as Scotland. So the original churches in Britain were little houses, white houses. And why were they white? Well, I don't know. But they basically got one person to pray in them through the week and learn the gospel stories and gather people around on Sundays, just like you're gathering around. And gradually people said, "We want to be near people like this because they're true people, they're loving people, they know the truth, they've got a purpose, they tell these wonderful stories about God." And so they wanted to be living nearby. And so some of these little white houses grew and grew and grew into little villages, which we can talk about on another day. And so this sort of thing developed. Well, now, but then eventually, of course, churches became big and houses died out a bit. So what happened after that in the next millennium? Well, not a lot, but there were people called anchorites. They're kind of hermits. And churches had the idea that everybody was far too busy doing these beautiful liturgies and things to pray for people, individual people, and know them. So they would employ, I don't like this idea, but I'm just telling you it happened, they would employ a person to live in a little room, little house, an annex to the church, who would pray for everybody in the town by name. And of course everybody in the town wanted to be prayed for, so they gave money to keep the thing going. Well, and if you go to Chesterless Street near Durham, you can see the best preserved anchorite's house at the Church of St Cuthbert. Very well preserved. It's a little museum now. And you'll see they actually had 3 anchorites after a time, and they've got 3 little rooms there. So that did go on. But as time passed, that died out, and we come to the present time. What's happening now? Well, there's a revival going on for houses of prayer. Well, in the Hebrides, you know, there was a famous revival in the 1950s, and it started in a little cottage of Peggy and her friend, so-and-so, I've forgotten her name, who was aged 82 and 85. This is hope for all of us. You are never too old to be used by God in a cottage to start a revival. And anyway, the people started turning to God. And so they invited a famous Bible preacher called Duncan Campbell to come, and he said, "Right, well, I'll give my message." And when he finished his message, late at night, it was nearly midnight, he gave the blessing, thinking everybody go. It was in a house, and then a young man got up and said, "Oh Lord, you want us to stay here to be cleansed." And they stayed for another 4 hours till 4 o'clock in the morning. And then he went back. He hadn't hardly got any sleep. He went back to this little cottage where the 2 ladies were praying, and they said, "Well, you can't go to bed, you've got to pray." They said, "The Lord has told us while we've been praying that there's a revival going to come out in the village down there where nobody wants God and nobody likes revival. And you better go down there." Well, said Duncan Campbell, "I don't think that's at all advisable. I've been advised that they don't want the revival and we've got to respect their wishes." "Oh, you've got to learn to listen to God, Mr. Campbell. The Lord's told me, and you take my word. You go down there and there'll be 7 young men who will be pillars of the church, and they'll be crying out to God outside the police station or in the haystacks. You go down there now." So he goes down there at whatever it was in the morning, about before dawn. and find that exactly that was happening. And these young men were crying out to God in the haystacks and in front of the police station. So never give up hope if they arrest you and take you to the police station. You never know what might break out. Anyway, so this revival spread all through the Hebrides, and it spread into little cottages. Now my friend Graham, who's just moved to Shetland, is he mad? He once took a holiday in the Hebrides, in that area, and he had a great desire to go to that cottage where the revival had started, but he had no idea where it was. But he just had a feeling in his heart. Well, he went to a church, didn't know what church, and as he was leaving, driving his car from the car park, somebody came over and said, "Oh, there's a group of us going to meet in a house for a prayer meeting. Would you like to join us? You can have a spot of lunch." So he said, "All right, I'll come follow you in the car." And went to it. And lo and behold, it was the very cottage where the revival had started, and they were still having prayer meetings. So things like that happen, but also there are other things, and I'll have to shut up now. I went to Canada, and there's a place called Madonna House, and that is a house of prayer, but lots of people can come and have little postinias in the ground. So they've got a farm, and a postinia is a little shed where you have just a cross, a table and a Bible. In a posh postinia you could have a bed and sleep the night. And there you go away to seek God. And postinias are growing all over the place. And so we are finding that more and more people are saying, yes, let's have houses of prayer. Sometimes it's a single person who's got their own home and just wants to dedicate it to prayer. Sometimes it's a group of people who say, we'll have prayer meetings here at certain times and invite all the neighbours. And in my book on houses of prayer, I've suggested 51 ways you can use a house of prayer, because everyone is different and everyone is unique. But I'd like to end with this saying, which may be a way in which God can speak to us. If there is righteousness in the heart, there will be beauty in the character. If there is beauty in the character, there will be harmony in the home. If there is harmony in the home, there will be order in the nation. If there is order in the nation, there will be peace in the world. God bless you.